Yeah. So this is a coalition that's coordinated through Greater Washington, and they've been doing Week Without Driving now for a couple of years, and it's really sort of built and grown there. And they've found it to be incredibly useful to moving forward, right? This conversation around transportation access, and they're at a place where they can, ask elected officials and hold them accountable and publicly, talk about the folks who said yes, who are highlighted there on the website, and then they also have a tab of folks who didn't respond.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Anna Zivarts, author of the book When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. We profiled this book when it came out about a year ago, and we are going to be talking about the Week Without Driving campaign that she helped launch about 5 years ago, and is now in the third year of being an initiative nationally and internationally. So we're going to talk about the data from this past year and talk about some of the updates and changes for this coming year. But before we get into that conversation, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Hey, it's super easy to do. If you're here on YouTube, just click on the join button right down below, or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options. Okay, let's get right to it with Anna. Anna Zivarts, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Active Towns podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be back here. Thanks.
I'm chuckling because we had you here at the fabulous launch of your book. Yay! Oh. Get that in focus there.
Nice props.
We also did a bike ride together, here in Austin when you were here to deliver a keynote address for, I think it was the annual Congress for New Urbanism chapter. And we got to do a bike ride, but we didn't really take any video or photos of it. There's no proof that it actually happened, but we had a ball.
We did. It was so great to get to see more of the city and more of the city from the back of a bike. So best way to explore a new place.
I love the fact that you were like game. You were like, heck yeah, let's go out and explore and get out on the bike. And we did a pretty major a bike ride out to the Mueller community and Mueller development. And before we hit the record button, you were saying you were back out at the Mueller development recently.
Yeah. I got to stay out there this summer. I was doing a bike ped safety assessment with NHTSA for the state of Texas. And I was so excited when they sent us our hotel information that we were staying in Mueller, because I was like, this is the best place to have a conversation about land use and safety, right? Because we can talk about how can land use actually help us reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled, the distances and the speeds that we need to travel. And so I was excited to be based there and have that sort of frame for the whole conversation around safety.
And that's such a good point, because a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, because spoiler alert, folks, what we're talking about today is the Week Without Driving. So much of this is dependent on there being legitimate choice and options for people from mobility to be able to get to meaningful destinations. And so much of that is tied to land use and how we design our cities.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. I mean, I keep on telling people it's like transportation is only half of the equation, right? The other half is where can you live and where do you need to go and how far are those apart? And, if we're not looking at that half, we're really limiting ourselves in the solutions. So,
and you do cover that in your book. I mean, you do talk about the fact that you cannot talk about one without having the other. You talk about the fact that, you have to have affordable, plentiful housing that's close to the meaningful destinations that people are needing to get to. So it's not like, from a land use perspective, it's not just like, building, incredibly expensive mansions, It's like, people need to be able to have the ability to live one's life and not feel like you have to be dependent on a car, because many of us in our society are non-drivers.
Exactly. Right. And it shouldn't be a luxury either. to be able to get where you need to go. And unfortunately, because of the high cost of housing and because people do want to live in walkable, transit-rich neighborhoods, those neighborhoods are often expensive neighborhoods. And so, people who really need that connectivity are priced out in so many parts of our country. Not everywhere, right? There's examples of it not being the case, but a lot of times, when we do then go to build that affordable housing, well, where is land cheap? It's cheap on the outskirts of communities, and that's where it goes. And then people get even more isolated who can't afford to drive or can't drive.
Yeah. Excellent point. Well, for those who don't know who you are, let me turn this over to you for a little 30-second introduction. So who is Anna?
So I guess I'll start. So I'm low vision. I was born with a visual impairment called nystagmus, and it makes my eyes shake a little bit all the time. And that means that I do not see well enough to drive. And that's been sort of a defining feature of my life and has shaped very much, where I am and with the work I do. For a long time, I lived in New York City, and it was great to live there for me because I didn't have to define my life as much as someone who couldn't drive. Now I'm back in Washington State, and it is a much more sort of a limiting factor of the places I go and the people I'm friends with, the activities I do. What I do now is organizing other non-drivers, and started that work working at Disability Rights Washington, which is a disability advocacy organization here in Washington State. I just left about a month ago in October 2025 to launch a new organization that's going to take this to the next level. There we go, the Non-Drivers Alliance. And so, as I was working at Disability Rights Washington, what I came to see is that, people who can't drive because of disabilities are just part of this larger community of non-drivers. There are so many folks who are too young to drive, who have aged out of driving, who can't afford to drive, who don't have a valid license to drive, or who are voluntary non-drivers who are choosing not to drive because, they can set up their lives in ways that it works great not to. And all together, we can be a movement that pushes for less car-dependent communities. And so that's what we're doing with the Non-Drivers Alliance. We've got two specific projects we're launching with. One is organizing non-drivers and transit-reliant non-drivers here in Washington State to get representation on transit boards to make sure that our transit systems are serving our needs. And the other one is to support the ongoing growth of Week Without Driving, both nationally and internationally. And so my colleague Ruth Rosas, who is formerly at America Walks, she's joining me shortly to really take the lead on that Week Without Driving work. And so it's exciting to be launching this and be working with her to grow.
Yeah, and you mentioned Week Without Driving, so let's pull up the graphic from this year here. We've got the Week Without Driving, which was just happened September 29th through October 5th. I happen to have been in Boulder, Colorado that week, operating as a non-driver. I was able to get around for that entire week, going about doing my on-bike interviews and doing an entire adventure, actually, with a fellow YouTuber content creator, Ryan Van Duzer. He had a little gathering with a whole bunch of people coming in from all across the country. And we did everything by bike and or transit, etc. that whole week. I loved it. And it's just, to me, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a reflex. It's kind of a habit now for me when I travel around North America and Europe, for that matter, of having my Brompton bicycle and having access to good transit. I can kind of get to where I need to get to, whether I'm, going from Boulder down to Denver. I can jump on the bus. There's a wonderful Flatiron Flyer bus that gets me down there. And it's just natural for me. It's instinct. It's habitual and instinctual for me to do that. But that's not the reality for most people in North America. Hence, the Week Without Driving. Give us a little more of a background on what this is all about, the Week Without Driving.
Yeah, and to start with the background, maybe I'll start with where it started and how it came to be. And so we launched it here in Washington State in 2021. And so early in the pandemic, I had spent about a year doing interviews with non-drivers from throughout our state, sort of as a political organizing tool and as a way to collect stories. And we really were intentional about wanting to make sure that we were collecting stories from non-drivers in every single one of our 49 legislative districts here in Washington State, because we had this experience of going to legislators and asking for more funding for transit or for sidewalks and hearing, oh, well, everybody in my community drives. Nobody uses the sidewalks, right? Nobody walks anywhere. And we knew that wasn't true, but we needed the stories and the data to back it up. And so that's sort of, we'd done the story collecting. And then we were ready to go back to those same elected officials and leaders of agencies, right? And other people working in transportation and land use and say, hey, look, we want you to try for a week to get around without driving yourself, to experience what it's like for the community members in your community who exist, who are non-drivers, to navigate their daily lives. What is that experience like? And then we offered to connect them and introduce them to non-drivers in their communities so that they could hear about the experiences of other people who maybe had different barriers, different disabilities, different economic situations, different caregiving situations, so they could, expand their awareness beyond sort of their own experience and also learn from non-drivers who they represented.
It's an example, we use this example all the time in active mobility advocacy and transit advocacy efforts to try to get city staff and city leaders to be able to appreciate and have better empathy for what it's like to be able to get around in another way. A great example, a trick of the trade that's been used. I think I first saw Dan Burton use it of, always having a wheelchair handy, when doing a walkabout and a walk audit, so that you can put the director of transportation or planning, into that wheelchair and say, okay, try to get around, try to navigate as we do this walk audit. Same with somebody with a visual impairment such as yourself. It's like, okay, how are you going to be able to get around and navigate in your environment here? And so what I love about this particular initiative, the Week Without Driving, is it helps emphasize or, helps support that ability to have a sense of empathy and awareness of what it's like to try to go a week without driving.
Yeah, and I think it's important, for elected leaders and others who are doing this, who normally do have the privilege of driving, to say, okay, yeah, my experience, like, it's not a simulation of disability, right? Like, my experience is not going to be the same as someone who, has a disability, or someone who, say, if you can afford to take a ride hail anywhere you need to go, and you don't have that economic pressure of not having that escape hatch, it's a different feeling than saying that you have to rely on the bus, and when that bus doesn't show, you miss that doctor's appointment, right? And so we want them, to see that and recognize that, but also to listen to community members and to know that there are community members who can't and don't drive in their communities. And so for me, it really is like, it's about this awareness on non-drivers and involuntary non-drivers, people who aren't doing it because it's, easy or comfortable. It's because they don't have other options. And it really has, I think, started and deepened that conversation in so many communities about the existence of non-drivers, and that we are such a large percentage of the population. And I think that part is also a shock to many decision makers and the public, right, who thinks, okay, everyone drives. The reality is that about a third of us don't. NDRC just came out with really cool research showing that 36.6% of the U.S. population over the age of 10 are non-drivers. Yeah. Yes, Boom. There we go. That's the website. Yeah, check it out. You can look it up by your state. You can even go down to census tracts and dig in deeper into the data. And I think, I was just in DC talking to folks on the Hill about transportation issues, and this data was eye-opening. And I think also really helped us have a conversation about unmet transportation needs in so many communities, both urban and really rural, right? There are lots of rural non-drivers. So just want to point out that data data and say that, the week without driving really is about uplifting the stories of non-drivers, the existence of non-drivers, and what it would take for us to, have a community where everyone, whether or not you can drive, can still get where you need to go.
Yeah. And I mentioned that I was in Boulder, and Darcy Kitching at the Boulder Chamber Transportation Connections, who was at Impact, let me know that her team put together a wonderful profile of a variety of folks who, where this is not something, every week is a week without driving. And so they tried to highlight some of these individuals that are, living in Boulder and where every week is about this. And that's kind of to your point too, is this initiative is to enhance awareness and give others a sense of what this is like, so that we can move things forward. We can get change. We can get policy change. We can get changes on the ground. But at the same time, organizations and entities and locations around the country, like what happened there in Boulder with the Boulder Chamber Transportation Connections, they were participating. What were some of the data points for this week, this year? Give us an indication as to how many entities and groups that you know of, because I'm sure some happened and you didn't even know about it.
Exactly. Yeah. And we're still collecting that data, right? We have some surveys out around, participation and getting folks to share their stories around, what worked. Mostly, we were able to pull news stories. We've been going through social media. We've been collecting examples from all over the country and the world. We know that we had over 600 co-hosting organizations from all 50 states and 14 international communities, which is pretty cool. And over 1,000 elected officials from 49 states participated, as well as some other international folks. And so that's great. We had tons of media coverage. And I think, I was actually, we mentioned MPAC. I was just there this week, and someone came up to me from Lexington, Kentucky, and they described to me how, the week without driving has allowed them as local organizers and folks who are trying to start a conversation about how we make communities work better with less car dependence, has really allowed them to build a coalition and a broader coalition around these issues. And I love that, because I think when we talk about non-drivers, it represents so many different groups of folks, whether that's children or seniors or disabled folks, low-income folks, immigrant communities, right? Choice non-drivers, the biking and, active transportation communities, transit folks, right? Transit agencies, public health agencies, right? And it allows us to come to the table and start to have these conversations together. So I'm excited about this year, and we're going to continue to grow and see where it goes to next year as well.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, some of the documentation, the TV highlights that are out there. You pulled together a little video on, some of the highlights that were out there. I'm thinking now would be a good time to play that. Do you agree?
Go for it.
Should we do
Yes.
that? All right.
Yeah.
Let's do this.
Next week marks day one of a week-long effort to get people who can drive or afford a car to experience what life is like without personal transportation.
Central Oregon Community College is taking part in the National Week Without Driving.
Advocates in the Coulee region are looking to spread awareness about the difficulties of people who can't own or drive a vehicle.
Now, many of us have cars and enjoy the privilege of driving to where we need to go when we want to. But according to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, 40% of residents in the city of La Crosse don't drive. Now, this can make life less accessible for non-drivers. In order to fully understand what life would be like without a car and how our public transportation system can improve, there is a challenge to try not driving.
The group is inviting the public to participate in its Week Without Driving campaign. According to Living Streets Lexington, 1/3 of the city's residents are unable to drive.
Getting to work, buying groceries, making a doctor's appointment without a car, it's a daily reality for them. And in a society like ours built around vehicles, it can present some serious challenges.
Mesa County Regional Transportation Office urges you to consider what it'd be like to try to get to an appointment or go to work without your own car.
Grand Valley Transit is inviting community members to join them in a week without driving. an event that lets the community consider the everyday reality of those who don't drive.
It starts Monday, and will let Austinites who have cars experience the city through the lens of non-drivers.
Next week really is an eye-opening opportunity to see our city and our transportation system in a different way and to build empathy for the thousands of Austinites who don't drive.
The Idaho Walk Bike Alliance is challenging people in Pocatello to ditch their cars this week.
A Week Without Driving campaign focuses on advocating for more accessible and inclusive transportation options.
This week kind of gives you a glimpse in how many things you can do without actually getting in your vehicle. Give it a shot and see what it's like to go 1 week without driving.
The North Coast is taking part in the annual Week Without Driving. This initiative challenges residents, especially local leaders and decision makers, to step into the shoes of community members who can't drive.
The Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, along with several partner organizations, are behind the annual event. The goal is to help people experience the challenges non-drivers face in rural areas like Humboldt, where public transportation options are limited.
For 1 full week, Santa Cruz County and Metro are encouraging people to find other ways to get around. Throughout the week, council members from across the county and county supervisors will be riding the bus to get firsthand experience in hopes of remembering their own experiences when voting on infrastructure funding.
Love it. How cool is this to like, from that original idea of trying to do this and getting it off the ground to seeing it, what is this, the third year?
Fifth year, third national year, fifth year, yeah.
Okay, so third national year, fifth year in total. I mean, how cool is this, the third national year, to see and to be able to collect, that information across so many, different cities across the nation from all different areas of the country. I mean, that whole Kentucky thing, you have that experience that you literally just had earlier this week, backed up by, a poll, video little clip that you were able to pull from Lexington, Kentucky. How cool is this?
It's really cool. And places, like Idaho, right? Not known for
everywhere.
being, Yeah. I love how this resonates in, it's not just big cities, right? And I think that's important to recognize, because I think so many sort of, hotbeds of active transportation, biking, transit advocacy are in big cities. That's where there's a lot of density. That's where, there's these sort of historical resources and groups that do this work. And yet there's really wonderful and exciting work happening in other places too. And this message is resonating because there are non-drivers, right? And a lot of small towns and rural communities. It's not just big cities. And so I think that part of it is really interesting and cool to see.
Yeah. Now, this is a Streets blog post that you published prior to this year's, Week Without Driving. And I think that this is a big part of what we need to kind of tease out is, okay, what kind of impact is this week of awareness having nationally and internationally now?
Yeah, this one is cool because people are sort of, especially when you go to funders, right? Like, what is it? What's the impact? Sure, it's great to do awareness, but what do you want to change? And I think, what I want to change really is this awareness about non-drivers. I think, it is transformational to recognize that a third of the population isn't served by our current transportation system that is car dependent, right? And so that part is huge. We've definitely had some other concrete wins though. There's folks in Pittsburgh and in Pennsylvania, Pittsburghers for public transit have been tying this to campaigns for more transit funding, for statewide efforts also to support more transit funding and resources. So that part's really exciting. In Washington State, we've tied it to campaigns for sidewalks, right, and sidewalk maintenance, and to get transit riders able to be appointed to transit boards. So that those are both sort of outshoots of this work. The DC folks, Greater Washington has found this campaign to be extremely useful. It helped them sort of conceptualize this idea of a time tax that transit riders pay compared to drivers, and starting to sort of think about, well, what would it mean to talk about that and talk about ways to reduce that time tax by having more frequent and reliable transit service. So those are a few examples. And I think as it sort of continues over time in places. In Washington State now, right, we've done it for 5 years in a row, and it really does become the sort of basis that folks can reflect on and use as they're working with us for change, right? That they know that they had this experience, that it's an experience that connects them to the community members that need this change, and that allows us to push things forward.
Yeah, and you just mentioned Pittsburghers for Public Transit. This is their landing page, their website here, and I love that fact that we can utilize this momentum that gets from a week of or a day of these types of initiatives that we have to be able to give some additional ammo to action alerts and trying to actually get policy changes, and like we said earlier, to get things on the ground. And one of the biggest challenges in North America, of course, with really that challenge of first and last mile when it comes to public transit. It's like you have to have a welcoming, safe, all ages and abilities welcoming environment, so that somebody can get and utilize public transit effectively. And I think you and I talked about this in our first interview, because it's a major theme in your book as well.
It is, right? I mean, one of my collaborators, Crystal Montero, says you can't have transit if you don't have the sidewalk, right? Especially for folks with disabilities, but really for everyone. That we can't just run buses. That's not enough. You got to be able to get there, right? And it's got to be a safe and comfortable experience if you're going to want to do it.
Yeah. And as a Brompton guy, I'm also like, don't forget the fact that bike, train, bike, bus combination is truly, truly magical, in the sense that if you've got a safe and inviting environment, a built environment which encourages active mobility of all types, people rolling and strolling, you have a ninefold catchment area increase if you can get on a bike and be able to get to a meaningful destination. So that power that I experience when I'm in Denver, when I'm in Salt Lake City, and I can get on the train, I can get on the bus, I can then know that I've got a safe bit of infrastructure that can get me to my ultimate destination. I'm not limited by how far I can walk. I can actually, feel comfortable that, oh yeah, not a problem. 3 miles, I can knock that off in no time at all on my little Brompton.
Oh my gosh, I could talk forever with you about, that sort of bike transit connections and like what we need to be doing to make that. Because if you have a traditional 2-wheel bike or even a Brompton, you can bring that Brompton anywhere with you. But if you're carrying a kid, right, or you have an e-bike, like it gets a lot trickier. And so how can we have transit that can accommodate more types of bikes, I think is important. And also just from a technology perspective, maybe be more creative about the bikes that we have, that to give them that sort of boosted capacity for passengers and, cargo and all that. I had my dream bike for a while was this Kona that was a long-tail Kona, and I could carry my kid on it up until he was like 6, and I could fit it on a bus rack. And that was like, magical. And then he outgrew it. He got too heavy. And, now it's tricky because it's not like I can put the e-cargo bike on a bus. It just isn't going to happen. So, yeah. But sidetrack there.
Yeah, no, sidetrack there. But it's one of the things that, because in North America, we are dealing typically with distances, unless you are privileged enough to live in a New York City or a Washington, D.C., where, being a non-driver and living a car-free or car-light lifestyle is sort of like, oh yeah, this is the most practical and pragmatic thing for me to do because, the built environment, supports that. Most of North America isn't that. Most of North America, our trips are longer distances. And so being able to leverage a safe and inviting all ages and abilities mobility network, or layers of different networks, the transit network, the bike network, the pedestrian network, and also the motor vehicle network, have those options are so incredibly powerful and empowering for people who need that mobility choice and those options.
Yeah, No, I was listening to your Brompton episode recently, and our household just acquired a third Brompton, so now there's one for each of us. But it doesn't quite fit my kid. He's got to grow a little bit more. And I was like, man, there should be some like kid adaptive Brompton, handlebar setups or something. So for slightly smaller people, because when he's able to bring that Brompton with us, like the amount of freedom we'll have traveling will be incredible. But I can't bring a kid's bike on an airplane, right? So, or a train easily, right? And so the Bromptons are great. Yeah,
it's funny too, and I'm glad the conversation sort of shifted in this direction just a little bit, because when it comes to this concept of non-drivers and having systems that are supporting of families, I can't remember where this is. Was this Paris that I just saw, where they have a whole bunch of the bike share bikes now come equipped with child seat on the back?
Oh, that's so cool. That is, I mean, I've ridden like the bike share in New York City with my kid, not in a good way, but yeah. Yeah, that's really exciting. I mean, and you see here in Seattle, so many folks, we have a lot of the Lime, sit down and stand up scooters. The sit down ones, you see two people on them all the time. You see parents and kids all the time, and the stand up ones too, because people need to go places with other people. And we're not, I think there's not enough intention around designing micromobility forms that meet that need.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as the dust is settling on the Week Without Driving this year, other than the data that we already talked about, what are some of the things that sort of resonate with you after 5 years of doing this, 3 years at the national level? What are some of the things that have really bubbled up and you're excited about, especially looking forward to next year and the years after that, and with the Non-Drivers Alliance being launched?
Yeah, I am really excited to have this continue to grow and support it and growing in places where, people might not see themselves as bike advocates or, as transit advocates. And this is sort of a really easy way to start having a conversation. And for communities that maybe are, focused on other issues, to start talking about, well, okay, if we're focused on healthcare access, how are people getting to our doctor's appointments or to our hospital, right? It can be such a barrier for non-drivers. Or food access, right? How are people able to get to grocery stores or to the pharmacy? And really starting to connect it more and build a conversation in places where there's not a lot of conversation around transportation access, but it is something that is really impacting people's needs. So that's sort of where I'm hoping it goes. I think, one beautiful thing about the Week Without Driving is that it is so decentralized. And so while Ruth and I, can provide toolkits and guidance, and we have some, monthly webinars to get people excited about it throughout the year, it really is up to local organizers and local advocacy organizations and local transit agencies, right? To take this on and shape it the way they want to shape it. So it meets their community's needs. So they're highlighting the needs of non-drivers in their specific region. And so that part is really cool, that decentralized part, because we see, so many cool and interesting and creative ways to celebrate the week and celebrate non-drivers and talk about barriers coming out of, different places, whether it's transit bingo or bus wraps or free rides or walk audits, right? Stickers and events and bike rides. I'm trying to think of there's just, so many different cool and interesting ways for communities to talk about these issues. And I love seeing that. So every year there's, sort of new and interesting things that bubble up. And so we're looking forward to next year. The dates, I'm just making sure that I had them right, so I'm going to read them. But it's September 28th through October 4th. Sunday, October 4th are the dates for next year. All that information about it will be on the Week Without Driving website. We have not updated from this year yet. We'll be working on that as we get it going. But in the meantime, if you are someone who participated this year in a Week Without Driving, we'd love to hear from you. Whether or not it was part of, an official campaign or with an organization, we have a survey for participants that's up on the website. We have some really fun prizes that are available for people who take the survey. Transit app and Island Press, Life After Cars donated a book. So we'll be, So we have some good stuff to give away. Parking Reform Network donated some swag. So we will be raffling that, giving away that stuff to folks who respond to the survey. So if you are someone who had an experience, want to reflect on that experience for a week without driving, let us know.
Oh my gosh, now I'm bummed I don't have Active Towns swag anymore. I would like donate some swag.
Well, for next year, you'll hopefully hit you up and you'll have something. Yeah,
for sure. Well, earlier you mentioned the DC Transportation Equity Network area and some of the work that's being done there. They came up with a really interesting thing of the scorecard. Talk a little bit about this, because I think this is one of the interesting things that different organizations, in their respective communities, can like sort of be transparent and say, yeah, and by the way, these are the officials, the public officials that have committed to supporting the week.
Yeah, so this is a coalition that's coordinated through Greater Washington, and they've been doing Week Without Driving now for a couple of years, and it's really sort of built and grown there, and they've found it to be incredibly useful to moving forward, right? This conversation around transportation access. And they're at a place where they can, ask elected officials and hold them accountable and publicly, talk about the folks who said yes, who are highlighted there on the website. And then they also have a tab of folks who didn't respond. And so I think that's great for them to start to hold people accountable. I think that's something I aspire to do more in Washington State as we grow our base of transit riders here and communities across the state, is using it as a way to engage with folks who maybe transit isn't a big part of their daily lives, but they're on the transit board, right? And so how can they engage with the constituency that they can learn from?
Yeah. That's so true. We had some indications of this, but how bipartisan is this?
I feel like the non-driver frame is something that resonates across the aisle, right? Because we're talking about access. And I always start every sort of presentation I have with folks asking them to think about who in their lives, in their community, and maybe in their own household, maybe in their family or extended family, who do they know who can't drive or can't afford to drive, maybe is too young to drive, has aged out of driving, and even reflecting on their own experience as a young person who couldn't drive yet. What was that like? How do people in their community get around who can't drive? And it's really interesting because I've yet to encounter anybody who says, I really can't think of anybody. And sometimes they do, and then they'll come back to me at the end of my presentation. They'll be like, oh, actually, right? I did think about this, and my brother-in-law doesn't drive. He, is, and so starting there, I think, is a place for us to begin to say, okay, look, like there are people all over this country who can't drive in every single community. And we design a transportation system that requires driving. And then it excludes people who really want to be able to, have jobs, go to doctor's appointments, meet with friends, have coffee, go places, right? And that doesn't have to be that way, right? It's not, it can, there are other ways to design communities. There are other ways to connect communities. There are ways that we can set up systems for, even in more rural areas, for people to have access and reliable access that doesn't just depend on, asking favors from friends and family, which is great when it works, but, it doesn't always work. And then, people get stuck at home, and there's this sort of like cycle of depression that comes from that isolation. And that isn't something we have to have, right? So I think that's a message that can really resonate. And in my experience, it does resonate with everyone, right? Because it isn't an experience that's limited to, just big cities or, just folks who want to bike places, right? It's a message that can resonate more broadly.
Yeah. And for me, it fits well in this narrative of what I talk about every single day, which is striving to have mobility options for all ages and all abilities. Is that, we're all, every single one of us has had a period of our life where we were non-drivers, when we were too young to drive. And then probably every single one of us, if we're lucky, will get to a point where we don't drive in the latter half of our life too, as well as just from an abilities perspective, our or ableism of being able to do things is very much, it can change in a moment's notice. And so having that awareness, I think, of that, no, literally, this isn't just a wacko liberalism lefty thing. This is what we're talking about. It should resonate with everybody across the political spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, the affordability piece too, I think is big. Like car ownership is expensive and budgets for many folks are really, really tight. And, even maybe your household has a car, but you're sharing it with a couple of adults or, you don't always have access to that car because, someone else in your household needs to use it. That is also, you are a part-time non-driver. And that's great. Like let's figure out if you do need to go places and that car isn't available, how can we make that possible for you? And so, I think that's an argument that resonates as well.
What is your dream in terms of this, like really taking off and resonating again across the political spectrum? Is there something at the state level? Is there something at the national level that, needs to happen so that we can take this to the next level?
This started from like a place of me growing up in a pretty rural area, not really feeling like I was the only person who couldn't drive when I turned 16, right? And that isn't true, and that wasn't true. But there just is, I think there's also a shame and a stigma of not being able to drive, especially if you can't afford to. And so, and then there's obviously a lot of shame and stigma around disability, right? And people aging out of driving, right? And so, part of it is like, I want it to be normalized to be a non-driver. And then I want it to feel, and that's, a goal at every sort of jurisdictional level, right? Is like, let's have that be a normal experience. Let's accept, I think there's been part of what's been interesting about this, writing a book and talking about it and talking about non-drivers is the sort of pushback, that I get around, well, there can't really be that many non-drivers, right? That data is not real. That's not good. Everyone drives. And I think that comes from this place of, well, okay, rich people can afford to drive, able-bodied people can drive, right? And, documented people can drive and really it, there are a lot of non-drivers, but it tends to be folks that get pushed to the margins or get, trapped at home and aren't able to go places, children as well, right? Not voting yet, don't count, right? And so so changing that, really becoming a political force because there are so many of us, becoming, having the agency then to begin to work, to shift where we're investing in transportation, to push back on projects that just expand road capacity and that actively often makes it more difficult to be someone who's trying to move outside of a vehicle, right? Or that makes community more dependent. So I think it becomes sort of a political question of, right, okay, first of all, insisting that we exist, and then second, beginning to build political power so that we can better design communities that work for the very large number of us who aren't being served, very directly aren't being served by car dependency. I think largely bigger picture, a lot of us aren't being served, even drivers. There's a lot of like, okay, maybe this isn't, the best system from a public health or resources perspective. But, for those of us who can't drive, we are actively excluded from the system. And so having that agency and that urgency in shifting things.
Yeah. And I like to say, too, that, from a community design perspective, there's nothing that aligns, better across the political spectrum than a community that really can work for everybody from a mobility perspective, to have mobility choice and options that engenders empowerment of mobility and freedom of choice. I mean, these are words that I think people can recognize, of like independence and freedom. These are good things, and everybody should get behind, and understand that it's like, even as a driver, if I choose to drive on any given day, I will benefit from the fact that other drivers maybe who have the choice and the option of a different mode, choose to take that different mode, because you just mentioned it. Because if there's too many drivers, then it doesn't even work well for drivers.
I think there's also a resiliency piece too, right? With having multiple options. And I think about this, like in my life, I'm super lucky that I can live in Seattle in a place where I can walk to the light rail in about a mile, or there's 2 buses, right? And if one of those systems gets messed up, I can switch to a different one. If all of them get messed up, I can bike, right? And having that sort of resiliency, that redundancy is important. Because inevitably, things break down, and we want to have that backup. So.
Well, and you mentioned something there, from a resiliency perspective, and having that backup in case of those times when things don't work. But there can be other times when you're like, oh, it's a beautiful day. I actually would prefer to jump on the bike and do this, or I would prefer to do that, that as a walk instead of jumping in a motor vehicle of any kind. And so it's, again, this is one of the things that I love about the Dutch mobility system that exists there, is they have that redundancy of mobility networks where you can mix and match and choose. You can drive, certainly, or you can choose to walk, bike, use public transit. I mean, that is, from your perspective in what you just said there's a resiliency to that. You have the options, the choice. And then you have your backup options too. That's brilliant. Yeah. Any final thoughts, Anna, that we haven't yet shared with the audience that you want to make sure you leave them with in preparation for next year, and what we can do in the interim, and how folks can get engaged and involved?
Yeah, I mean, I would say begin, for me, it's always that first conversation of like thinking about the non-drivers, right, in your community and in your life and your neighborhood, in your sort of social circle, and starting there and having conversations with people. And maybe you don't know them yet, but maybe take this as an opportunity to have that conversation. What is working? What is not working for mobility for you in our community? Like, what can we begin to shift? And I think building those relationships allows us to start to build a deeper, stronger coalition for change, so that it's not, often bike and sort of transit groups or urbanist groups tend to be a lot of folks with a lot of choices. And that's great because, they have the time, you have the resources, you have the capacity to show up and organize. But what would it mean to begin to bring in a broader coalition of folks who don't have as many choices, to be part of the conversation about what it would take to move away from car dependence? Because I guarantee you that people who can't drive have a lot of thoughts about how to make the system better, because we are sitting there, hours a day waiting for a bus to show up, walking down a highway without good infrastructure, thinking about, gosh, if only that pharmacy hadn't closed, I'd, not have to make this trek across town. And so, having those conversations help inform what we're asking for and what we're pushing for, and inform the way we're engaging with decision makers, because I think it also makes a really compelling argument when you start to bring in folks who have less choices into the conversation, into the room, and make an argument for why the system is broken and needs to change. So that's my advice, sort of big picture. And for small picture, check out weekwithoutdriving.org. If you do have a story you want to share with us about last year, great. And starting in the new year, we'll be having monthly webinars with different folks who have tried different tactics and done different sort of strategies to engage folks for Week Without Driving. So you can go there. You can actually look at all those old webinars on YouTube currently, if you're interested in sort of exploring what it's like for folks. But come join us in the new year as we get ready for Week Without Driving 2026.
Fantastic. And also head on over, in addition to the weekwithoutdriving.org, go on over to nondrivers.org And for those of you in Washington, there's a little form here. If you rely on transit and paratransit and you live in Washington State, please also register through that form there. And that's for those weekly seminars that are going on, webinar seminars.
Yeah, I got one starting in about 20 minutes. So
yay! Okay, well, I better let you go.
Yeah.
Thank you so very much for joining me once again on the Active Towns podcast. And this has been such an honor and pleasure having you on once again.
Thank you so much, John. Good to see you.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Anna Zivarts. And if you did, please, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, I'd be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and be sure to ring that notifications bell. And again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel and find it helpful, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Hey, super easy to do. You can just hit the join button right here on YouTube or navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all this video content, but you can also make a donation to the nonprofit, or you can buy me a coffee. Again, thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. And until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And again, just want to send a huge thank you to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel financially via YouTube memberships, YouTube super thanks, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit and joining my Patreon. Every little bit adds up and is very much appreciated. Thank you all so much.